Mr. Zappa,
Yes, Mr. Zappa.
Do you really think? I mean, all kidding aside, in this country, with the permissiveness that we are moving toward a fascist theocracy, anything goes.
We are, but
do you think things like this would have ever been permitted?
Smile again.
When we were 20, when we were kids, you're about my age, maybe
I'm
a little
45.
younger. Well, I'm 55. Do you think when I was a kid that they would permit songs like that to be sold? I mean, permissiveness is the game. I mean, exactly. You're not really serious if you're saying we're going toward a fascist theocracy.
That's right, we are.
Wait a minute.
In what way? Give me one example.
Wait. One example of a fascist theocracy.
When you have a government that prefers a certain moral code derived from a certain religion, and that moral code turns into legislation to suit one certain religious point of view, and if that code happens to be very, very right-wing, almost toward Attila the Hun...
Well, then you are an anarchist. Every form of civil government is based on some kind of morality, Frank.
Morality in terms of behavior, not in terms of theology.
Well, of course.
Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I am Jeff Smith. In 2020, the word doom scrolling was entered in the Oxford English Dictionary, which, considering the year, made sense. Global pandemic, economic recession, murder hornets. Getting online resulted in a gut check. What fresh hell might await us today? It's been a few years, and those factors that led to the adoption of the term doom schooling has passed. I mean, we can go outside, yes? But for those of us concerned about the state of democracy in the United States, doom scrolling continues, which each day providing examples of the slow motion backsliding of American democracy. Politicians demanding statements of fealty to secure government jobs, passing laws that punish businesses who don't follow the same ideological path, lawmakers removed from office for having the audacity to voice support for their constituents. Heck, rolling back child labor laws, are we sure we are still in this century? Some may be timid to call these developments fascism. Our guest today is not. We're joined today by Paul Street, an author and political commentator who is comfortable calling out fascism when he sees it. He does exactly that in his 10th book. This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. Hello, Paul, and welcome to Democracy Nerd.
Hey there. Thanks for having me. Welcome from Iowa City, Iowa, middle of a red state.
What do you mean or imply by the word Amerikaner? We can make our guesses, but would rather hear you talk about it.
Well, it's applied from the old term Afrikaner, which was the 300-year plus Dutch Anglo apartheid regime, racist regime in South Africa. I'm not sure I'm the inventor of the use of it on the left to describe the what I consider the neo-fascist Trump base, but I think I sort of got that started a little bit saying that, and it is used to some extent favorably. It's embraced by some folks on the alt-right. They like it. And it's a reference to the attempt to sustain minority racial rule in the face of, in South Africa, in reality, a black majority, but there's a great fear among the Trumpist base and the Trump Republican Party. There's a great fear of demographic white decline and an alleged related threat to European cultural values and a determination to suppress a multiracial democracy, if necessary, by any means necessary, vote suppression, gerrymandering, even open putschist attempts. One of the recurrent themes among the January 6th rioters was these weren't real Americans that voted out Trump. They don't really deserve to have a voice. This thing, this attitude, this hostility to a pluralist, majoritarian, multiracial democracy strikes me as very sort of throwback to the Afrikaners. And when I say apartheid, and that's what the South African regime was, we don't have formal apartheid rules, but we really have very real apartheid in the United States of America today. The way the real estate market works, the way how people settle, where they live residentially, where kids are schooled, and so on and so forth, and this concentration of Black and brown people and indigenous people in certain areas where opportunities are very low is very much a form of 21st century, I guess you could call it neoliberal, de facto apartheid and, where you live and the place of your residence and the place of your school is intimately related to your place in the socioeconomic and political structure. I suppose we have a kind of apartheid when you think about it jurisdictionally between our states. We have red states and blue states. We have blue regions and red regions. So apartheid seems very real and part of contemporary American life, and there's a very real political form to it with the agenda of the Republican Party nowadays. Minority rule to keep those people in their place, so to speak.
Term Afrikaner used to describe the ethnic group descended from Dutch settlers that arrived in South Africa, wielding political force for the next few centuries. You say majority, minority rule. That's your connection between the Amerikaners and the Afrikaners. You came up with another term. I think it was Trump and left, describing leftist thinkers and activists who dismiss, mock, and smear concerns about. Explain.
Yeah, now that's a term that's caught on a little bit more. I owe a little bit of a debt to the Counterpunch podcaster, Eric Draitser, who used to talk to me about the Trump left, and then he came up with the term the Trumpan proletariat, which is sort of a mocking term for the populist claim that the Republicans had that their base was all working class, which actually is not very supported by the social science and data on that. And I sort of put Trump left together with Trump and proletariat and came up with Trump and left. And at first I meant it kind of as a joke. I wasn't entirely serious about the term. And it kind of emerged out of these emails and social media posts that I was just habitually getting, typically, not always, from older, white, left-identified males who thought it was just silly to be particularly concerned about Trump, who thought that if you were particularly concerned about Trump, that showed that you were an apologist for and a friend of the corporate neoliberal capitalist Democratic Party, and who were convinced that it was just silly and preposterous to be connecting Trump and Trumpism to something as big and scary and European and 20th century as fascism. And I keep getting these lectures hitting upon these themes, and I realized that it really wasn't a joke. It wasn't just a little marginal kind of thing, and I think that term has sort of caught on, and I think you described it very well. It's leftist or left-identified thinkers and activists who dismiss, mock, and smear concerns about Trump. I'll tell you a real key calling card of when you're hearing from Trump and left is when because you talk about neo-fascism in the Republican Party and connect it to Trump, you get accused of having Trump derangement syndrome. Right there, you get accused of having Trump derangement syndrome with someone on the left. You might well be talking to a Trump and leftist. And I always like to say, it's a shame more people didn't get Hitler derangement syndrome in early Third Reich Germany in the early mid-1930s.
Yeah, no, the mocking, the sort of ad hominem attack of the pro-democracy critic of genuine threats to a democracy is maybe not that surprising a tactic. It can be tricky to address. Why do you avoid using the words totalitarianism and populism in your book?
Well, let's start with populism because that's more relevant in terms of the American political discourse. It's very common in the mainstream media, and I might add also in higher ed. I have a friend in political science. I've co-authored a book with him who is often relates to me how difficult it is in his field to actually use the F word and how the preferred word is for the right-wing Republican Party and its base right now is populism. I mean, at one level, Christopher Hitchens once said the essence of American politics is the cloaking of elitism as populism. It's sort of reversal. It's sort of universal. Every major political party, I suppose some minor ones as well, try to claim that they appeal to the broader populace, and then they have a populist aspect, and this is related to their being democratic. I guess I'm somewhat of an originalist about the term populism. When I think of populism, maybe this is because I'm a historian and I read Larry Goodwin's book, The Populist Moment. The original Populist Party was largely a left formation. It was labor, it was farmers, it was ordinary Americans opposed to the rising concentration of capitalist power, corporate power, and financial power, the trusts, and J.P. Morgan in the late 19th century. And it was egalitarian, and it was decentralist, and it was in many ways anti-capitalist. There's some passages from the original Populist Party that sound some of the most eloquent purple passages of denunciation of modern capitalism that you're ever going to read. And of course, fairly quickly, by the early 20th century, the original Populist Party had been somewhat hijacked by Southern and Western state racists and all of that. I think it's good to go with the F word. We can get into what I mean by fascism, in a little bit, because populism is often used, it seems to me, in such a way as to avoid the basic nature of what the Republican Party and its base have become today. To say populism is to cloak and diminish the significant extent to which fascism is capitalist. It's a product of and an agent of capitalism, sort of capitalism with the iron heel on our boot instead of with purportedly democratic elections and rule of law. I noticed the way populism is used a lot is used in a way to merge, I think, very dysfunctionally and deceptively, Trumpism with Bernie Sanders and with modern democratic socialism and with progressivism, right? It's used to sort of besmirch Sanders. There's a hidden sort of agenda in calling ugly, revanchist, racist, sexist Trumpism populism, because then you also see some of the same people saying this at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN are sort of, it's a backhanded way of fakely merging populism with progressivism, with actual genuine progressivism, and when you come to think about it, the original most virulent fascist regime called itself socialist, called itself national socialist, right? And you'll hear people get confused and therefore say, well, that just proves that socialism is Hitler. Totalitarianism is a little more difficult and maybe more far-reaching discussion than we have time for right now. But I think it's this relates more to how we understand 20th century regimes, it seems to me, and to call fascism, totalitarianism is often used in such a way as to conflate the Third Reich and the Mussolini state somewhat deceptively with the Soviet Union and with socialist communist China, and just all sort of merge them up in one big sort of mishmash of anti and non-democracy, which kind of makes certain key aspects of 20th century history very difficult to understand, like the 20 million Soviets that died in a life or death war between Russian socialism, or whatever you want to call it, bureaucratic collectivism on one hand, and capitalist armed neo-fascism Third Reich Nazi regime on the other hand, or for that matter, the conflict between Mao's burgeoning communist forces and the Japanese fascist regime in the 1930s and the 1940s. They're very, very different. And fascism, is somewhat, in classic forms, is somewhat misunderstood as totalitarian insofar as it is always, the term tends to underestimate the extent to which fascist governments have always, they've never had complete and total control over the minds and the institutions of the societies in which they have reigned. They've always depended on key alliances with church, key alliances with the corporate sector, with business, and so on and so forth. And it's a little bit deceptive. It's the state just doesn't take over everything under fascism. You can have fascist regimes and still have full-on private ownership in the means of production and powerful ecclesiastical forces backing the regime, and so on and so forth. I don't think that makes any sense, but that's part of it.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I too have a knee jerk and sober second sense resistance to the use of populism to describe Donald Trump. You do embrace one word that I hate. That, well, at least I hate its use, and the people who people listen to this show have heard my soapbox probably too many times on it, and that's the use of the word neoliberal. I find it unhelpful, and as a matter of large scale persuasion, and also inapt, unspecific, because it's been used in different ways, not merely now in I think the modern left, its most dominant usage is to describe not a new left. Its most dominant usage is to describe something that a median voter would not describe as liberal at all. Right? It's used to describe sort of fundamental, sort of market fundamentalism, and to say something that to most people sounds like new liberal means market fundamentalism, to me is confusing and unstrategic. But that is my take. But you can tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, we may disagree about that less than you think. I get irritated. I mean, my good friend Henry Giroux has a book, comes out every other year, that typically has neoliberalism in the title, and then you see neoliberalism, and this is across the left, repeated again and again. And I always say, and I'll tell you in a second why I still use the word, but I always think, and I always say, that neoliberalism is a fancy word for capitalism since the 1970s in this country, essentially returning to its pre-New Deal, or in Europe, pre-social democratic, savage, insecure, egalitarian norm. It's in many ways just the revamping of capitalism. Why I think the term can still be retained with that really critical qualification, and that's a very big qualification. I don't know if this is where you're coming from on it, but for me, neoliberalism is in fact capitalism. And the anomalous period in the history of capitalism was the 1940s through the early 1980s, when there were significant measures, at least within the West and within the rich countries, of social democracy, or whatever passes for social democracy in the New Deal era. Here, where I think you could still retain some validity, is that it marks an era. It marks an era of Western capitalist policy that was consciously formed by capital and its agents and its ideologues in response to, in this country, the New Deal era, the social democratic era in Europe, with a conscious effort, as opposed to, it's different than the original classic liberal capitalist assault on feudalism and mercantilism. Now, a conscious policy design formed in response to 20th century, in this country, particularly milquetoast social democracy, deregulation. But you're right. It's a return to classic market fundamentalism, though I must say of one that's very much with the state carrying it out. It's a conscious aim of the state. You could say there's conscious neoliberal policy, and claims to be against big government and for the free market, but it's very deceptive. What neoliberals, or what contemporary capitalists are against, is not the state per se. They're against the left hand of the state, any part of government that won anything for the people, that won anything for the common good, that won anything for the poor, that won anything for the environment, that was won by social movements. Anything in the 20th century needs to be dismantled. Those are the parts of big government that neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism hates. Prisons, the military-industrial complex, the warfare state, the police state, those parts of big government are fine. So and that's not new either. Capitalism has always relied on the state. It's always been state capitalism.
And I'll stay on the topic for a moment, because if we agree roughly that the word neoliberal has it can be a source of confusion, and I will tell you, if I wanted to make sure that there wasn't that something on the left side, center left, more leftward than center left, didn't get a majority, what I'd want to do is I'd try to make the word liberal be a bad word. I'd try to make sure that not that many people wanted to adopt that word, and therefore I might muck it up, or even
you're right.
I would at least love it if leftists said, like imagine it, it was when conservatives were saying neoconservatives were bad. That didn't that might have helped in if it meant that it would impact the national security conversation, right? But it didn't help conservatives win, and it certainly didn't help conservatives advance their sort of rhetorical position to make the word neoconservative
Right.
bad. At
Right.
least the good news about neoconservative is for them, neoconservative at least meant a conservative view. Right now, a neoliberal view as used by leftist writers tends not to mean what most people mean by a liberal understanding of an economy, even a liberal understanding of capitalism, using words the way most people use them. I do think it's worth coming, and I say this almost every time it comes up with somebody who I just get on my soapbox, and it's not primarily for the listeners. To all our listeners, I apologize. It's really to lobby you in hopes to lobby others, because I think we do need a new rhetorical architecture. I think we do need some new words that even just calling it capitalism, I think understates, right? It's like it might be fundamentalist capitalism. There might be another sort of pair of words that combines, right? So it's not just the free flow of capital markets, right? It is something more than that. It is not merely and even allowing the phrase free market, because the market ain't free, right? It's really expensive, and in fact, it yields its own control. So I think trying to figure out persuasive language. I'll get off my soapbox. We're primarily
Well,
here
I think that it isn't one of those classic kind of phrases that that people know what they're talking about within the incestuous discourse of left intellectuals. But to try and talk about it in a popular audience is not going to get you very far. And so it triggers people a little bit and sounds academic, as a whiff of the seminar room about it. I'll give you another example: intersectionality. I can't tell how many times I'm hearing intersectionality, intersectional this, intersectional that. I know what it means. It means the overlapping oppression systems of race and class and ethnicity and sexual orientation and all that. But I mean, come on. Or language is an issue. I've got into it with people about saying the word Latinx. Latinx. I know what it means. I know you don't want to say Latino instead, because it leaves out Latinas and you're looking for something else and it's sensitive to gender and pronouns. I don't know a Hispanic person. I've never met a Hispanic person, not one. Well, except maybe a few in academia that want to use the phrase Latinx. It's just doesn't go anywhere. And so, it's capitalism, but you say even capitalism could set people off.
I don't mean set people off. I mean
oppression systems. Yeah,
I don't mean merely set people off. I'm less concerned about triggering when I'm talking about this, right? I don't mean if we say that word it might offend somebody. What I mean is our capability to persuade. What I mean is our ability to communicate in ways that more and more people will feel like there's an on-ramp to them in the discussion, that they are part of the discussion, and that we're using words that make sense to more people, not trying to dumb down concepts, but yes, trying to talk like human beings talk. And I am sort of focused on that, but there is a word that you have no bones about using, and that is, you can make no bones in asserting Trump's presidency as being fascist, not as overstatement, not as maybe someday, but that I think is an accurate description of your description. Make the case.
Well, and again, sometimes that's a tough sell, but when I'm talking about fascism, and I've got to admit that this book, This Happened Here, is by an academic press. It is meant in part for a popular audience, but it involves a lot of engagement with academics, and particularly with consensus fascism denying academics in the history and the political science professions. But what I'm talking about is a number of things, and I've got to be careful here because it's a lot, but recurrent theme again and again in classic, what I call mustache fascism of the 20th century, Hitler, Mussolini, and all of that, and also true in the 20th century neoliberal era version, is this notion of a country that needs to be made great again, and that has been stabbed in the back and has been destroyed by a globalist conspiracy of an evil cabal that is trying to replace the virtuous, hardworking, typically white and rural heartland people, trying to replace them with demonized, as allegedly inferior, allegedly criminal, allegedly lackadaisical and lazy others. The othering of racial, ethnic, religious, sexual minorities and enemies, and us and them othering of them. So this notion of palingenetic nationalism, making a once great nation great again, the othering of it, eliminationism, the readiness to literally destroy your political opposition and wipe them out. I mean, this case in Montana where a transgendered state representative representing 11,000 voters has been removed from the Montana, have I got that state right? Has been removed from the legislature, or the attempt of the fascist Republicans in the Tennessee House to literally remove 2 Black legislators. That's a form of eliminationism. There's a strong anti-urbanism in fascism. I mean, and don't get me wrong, there's overlaps between fascism and all kinds of forms of conservatism and revanchism and backwardness. So don't get me wrong, but fascism, as part of its othering of racial minorities and also its othering of intellectuals and its othering of gay people and its othering of feminists, tends to be anti-urban and tends to look on the cities as big, scary places. Vienna for Hitler, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and LA for Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all that, because the cities are dark and scary and full of all these different kinds of more dark-skinned and radical, allegedly, people. There's an anti-intellectualism, there's an anti-truthism, there is an opposition and a hate to and hatred of independent media. There is almost always a conspiratorialism within fascism. There's an obsession with propaganda. Everything's politicized all the time under fascism. There's this constant propaganda machine, to the point that Tucker Carlson, the recently fired Tucker Carlson, goes nuts about the M&M logos losing their high heels, or Trump goes nuts about windmills, and he goes nuts about water-saving toilets. Everything is politicized all the time. There's a genocidal tendency in fascism, but to get to cross the finishing line and become fascist, to me, and this is really key, is an embrace of political violence and a readiness to break with previously normative, bourgeois, constitutional, electoral democracy, right? To actually not accept removal through elections, to actually be ready to use physical force to prevent or to cancel elections. Not just physical force. You know, there's also efforts through the courts. There's efforts through all kinds of other means, voter suppression, but a willingness to do that, and a willingness to break the rule of law if necessary to make the nation great again and to eliminate and defeat your enemies. One of the really key calling cards of fascism is lawlessness in the name of law and order. Never forget where Donald Trump went on the last night of the 2020 presidential campaign. He went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, in honor of Kyle Rittenhouse, who physically shot down George Floyd Black Lives protesters. I think fascism deniers lost their last legs to stand on with January 6th. January 6th sealed the deal. I know I'm going on a while about this, but this one historian that I used to argue with, who was the great historian of European fascism, Robert Paxton, he was just clinging to this absolute 20th century German and Italian version of it, kept denying that Trumpism was fascism. He had to go into Newsweek the day after January 6th and said, you know what? I was wrong. They had paramilitaries in the streets. Donald Trump take down the metal detectors because the guys with the AR-15s don't want to hurt me. You know, he wanted military assault. Can you imagine if military assault weapons had been included in the attack on the Capitol? When that went down, when that kind of lawlessness in the name of law and order, motivated by a classically propagandistic, anti-truth, big lie, a Leviathan lie that Goebbels would have envied, that the 2020 election was stolen. That they crossed the line right there. And it doesn't matter that they failed. They tried. And I think they came closer than a lot of people knowing to creating a state of emergency that might have enabled Trump to declare martial law and actually not get Biden certified. I mean, who the hell knows where that would have gone? But it was a hell of a thing. And anyone who's denying fascism after January 6th, to me, is losing credibility.
And up to then, I think there are a lot of people, myself probably included, who would, and maybe only because so many of us want to be polite, and it can be scary to use our second coming type. It can be scary to use our biggest, scariest words. And for those of us who are trying to engage, not in merely building heat, but in shedding light. And
yeah,
if we use our scariest words, well, is it just, we're saying the sky is falling, and we are saying that, and we are crying wolf, and we're just using overstatement to describe things that we don't like. The counter is that had January 6th been successful, if you in fact control the government through a paramilitary mob-led mob, or a paramilitary-led mob,
yeah,
then I think you'd have kind of the textbook, pretty close to textbook definition. And then is the only thing that makes something fascist versus borderline fascist, or the line between authoritarian or would-be authoritarian and
fascistic. Yeah,
is it? Yeah, is it fascist? Is the only dividing line success and failure? And therefore, are you only able to resist the fascist leader if they have already been successful in toppling a democracy? And that significantly reduces one's rhetorical tools in preventing that from happening. Because, of course, the thing that we'd like to avoid is actually fascism in charge.
Right. Yeah. And, in many ways, in part of also what you're coming up against, maybe triggering, we'll use that word before, scaring people. Also challenging them, that the historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat said something in an interview I read with her. She's this very interesting historian of Italian fascism. And she was kind of reflecting indirectly on the taboo in her own profession. Academia is very squeamish about this word of fascism. And she said, if you use it, it implies that you'd have to get up off your butt and actually do something about it. And let's be honest, a lot of people don't necessarily want to do that. And that's scary, but you're also challenging American exceptionalism. You're challenging this deeply embedded notion that we are a country of inherent virtuous liberty that is opposed to centralized state control, and we could never actually have bureaucratic collectivism, whether in socialist or communist form, or dictatorial control in fascist form. That's not who we are about. We are a nation of decentralized freedom, so you're challenging people's deeply held, almost doctrinal, religious kinds of beliefs about this. I want to mention that there was a very interesting interview with the historian Timothy Snyder, who's a guy that I disagree with about some things with regard to European and Russian and German politics, but who's really had a good nose for what Trumpism was really about. And I mean, this was early in the Trump administration, and he's talking to a very interesting guy I know at Salon named Chauncey DeVega. And this is in April 2017, which means, and the interview took place in March of 2017, very early on. And he's saying flat out, there's just no doubt about it, there's going to be a coup attempt at the end of this first term. And DeVega says, well, how could that be? He said, he's obviously not making any attempt to do the previously normal thing of trying to win a second term by advancing policies that majorities, or at least enough, right? We have the Electoral College, so you don't have to win the majority, but enough voter support to get reelected. He's clearly just he's just going through, he's clearly just going to try and ram this stuff through and ram this agenda through and be as brutish and horrible as possible. And then Snyder said, it's already written into it. There's going to be attempted Reichstag moment. There's going to be an attempted overthrow. And he called it very, very, very early on. But anyone who, there were those amongst us. Adam Gopnik at the New Yorker. I'm left of Gopnik. Me, that refused fascism. The people that refused fascism. Many people read Trump as a fascist. Robert Reich read Trump as a fascist as early as 2015. Many people are not surprised at all and folks that resisted the word and didn't want to deal with it and didn't want to face it because it's scary, because it doesn't fit their idea of America, got a really big wake-up call on January 6, 2021. And amazingly, as I show in my book, a number of left liberal intellectuals who kind of fall in this denial category still clung to dismissing the word and thinking it's silly to talk about it after January 6th. And, even now, with Trump saying to his base in Waco, Texas, of all places, where he's going as he's about to be indicted, and he's calling Black prosecutors animals, and he's telling his supporters, I will be your retribution. I will be your vengeance. If they try and indict me, if they try and impose the rule of law, there will be death and destruction. I mean, it's just, it's the denial is deeply embedded. That's not who we are. That could not happen to us. So,
In terms of things that people didn't think could happen, it was a surprise to very, very many that Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016. Nearly 7 years later, do you still see it, or was it ever to you? Does it seem now like a surprise, or does it make sense considered what's happened since and the overall current political climate?
I did a piece in May of 2016 on Counterpunch. I even forgot I did it, and I looked it up recently. It was titled "The Donald Can Happen Here." That's what it was titled. I forgot I even wrote that. And it was largely focused on the Democrats. It was largely focused on well, you don't like the word, but it was largely focused on the neoliberal corporate capitalist conservatism, of the what I call the dismal, demobilizing, dollar-drenched Democrats. Joe, nothing will fundamentally change. Biden, the very, the very deeply conservative Hillary Clinton campaign. And between that and what had been going on, between the demobilizing and uninspiring neoliberal, deeply conservative, Obama was deeply conservative, performance of the Democrats and what the GOP had been really in process of becoming, if you ask me, since Clinton, since Newt Gingrich, and since the contract with America, there had been this building obsession with whiteness and Christianity, and this ever expanding Christian white nationalism overtaking the more traditional business-oriented corporate republicanism of the original Bush and the original Reagan. There's always this fascist undercurrent going back to Nixon and even before in the Republican Party, don't get me wrong. But the Christian white nationalist thing had been taking over for a long time and clearly went ballistic. Something happened with Obama, and it has to do with race. There's something with the Tea Party went down that drove millions of squeezed, not always squeezed, demographically frightened white, disproportionately male, but not always, heartland Americans. Just, you could tell there was this bubbling thing. This is a concern I always had about Obama. And in my first two books on Obama, on national politics, which were about Obama, I warned that this guy was simultaneously going to trigger a ton of white angst and white populist nationalism on one hand, while doing very little to energize the Democrats' traditional progressive labor, minority working base on the other hand, in ways that were very dangerous. And so I wasn't particularly surprised. I did think Hillary would win. I've been in Chicago most of my life, but I've been in Iowa recently, and it's kind of interesting because you don't have presidential elections in Chicago. It's a Democratic city, it's a Democratic state. They barely campaign there. So I've had opportunities since being in Iowa, since being registered in Iowa, to actually vote in contested elections. So I looked at the Des Moines Register poll before 2016. I checked it first, see if it was safe to do my usual Chicago thing of voting, throwing away my vote for a left candidate. And I voted for Jill Stein. I probably wouldn't have. And the Des Moines Register poll is pretty accurate. They predicted very well. And they showed that Trump was running away with Iowa in 2016. It wasn't going to matter. It really wasn't going to matter. If it had been closer, I probably would have done the lesser evil thing like I did in '04, because I was so horrified by George Bush's invasion of Iraq that I held my nose and voted for John Kerry. It's the first time in my life I ever did that. So I did do the Jill Stein thing. I got it through my head that Trump was really going to win. And bear in mind, in May, I had done a piece called The Donald Can Happen Here. Can happen, but that it would happen when Bernie Sanders came to Iowa City, 2 blocks from where I'm standing right now, to College Green Park, in the Saturday after the Chicago Cubs had won the World Series, right? And that was a sign right there. The Chicago Cubs can win the World Series. Donald Trump can be elected. I wasn't excited about the Cubs because I'm a South Sider and White Sox, but whatever. The Cubs won. And I was like, oh, great. Things that you never thought could happen can happen. But the thing about it was a sunny day. It was beautiful. When Bernie was running against Hillary and was over at the Robert E. Lee Rec Center, half a mile west of here, it was overflow, mass hysteria, the love, the populism, the progressivism, the please, let's have a real Democratic presidential candidate in the mode of FDR. You know, let's resurrect non-neoliberal, a New Deal democracy. This gathering, the Saturday, I think it was, before the election, was dead, even though Bernie was there. Even though this great progressive hero was there, he couldn't even fill up College Green Park. People looked tense, they looked nervous. And he said to the late Jeffrey Cox, a U of Iowa historian who's a good friend of his, a big part of how Bernie came to Iowa. Actually, Jeff helped get Bernie to run in the first place. And Jeff Cox told me later that Bernie came up to him, went over to his house, which is right across from the park, right after that, and said, "It's like this everywhere I'm going. I'm trying to get people excited about Hillary in Michigan, in Wisconsin, where she wouldn't even freaking campaign, which was idiotic. I go to Wisconsin, I go to Michigan, I'm trying to get these blue collar votes for her, and I can't succeed." And I realized, Jesus, this guy could very well, damn well win. And boy, did he. Kurt, with some help in the Electoral College, right? You don't have to win the popular vote in America. Try and explain the Electoral College to people in Europe. They'll look at you like you're nuts.
Yeah, before I go to Electoral College, you said a couple of things I want to dig into a little bit. So you said you voted for Jill Stein, and because you looked at the polls and it didn't look like it was going to matter, and therefore you didn't have to engage in sort of lesser of two evils, and then right. There wasn't any energy behind Hillary Clinton. And when I hear that normally, that combination of things, it is typically when usually a smart leftist is making the case that if Democrats don't win, it's the fault of Democrats being too blank, right? Like too in cahoots with corporate power, too moderate on blank set of issues, typically economic issues, but there will be it can go a little bit broader than that, and very rarely do I hear a smart leftist saying this is what the left has to do that's smarter. This is how we have to build a movement that can get a majority of the country if we're in fact in favor of democracy. And this is how we can build a governing apparatus that works. And this is how we can become more persuasive, both with platform and with message delivery. And this is how we can organize better more often. And of course, I lived through, and to some degree, my political persuasions impacted by the Ralph Nader, the decidedly impactful Ralph Nader election. What do you think that the left needs to do to be smarter? What do you think the left needs to do to be more strategic?
Well, on this voting thing, let me just say a thing about that. I, by 2018, was in Refuse Fascism, and we wanted Trump, Pence out immediately. We wanted them out Puerto Rican style. We thought that this regime was fascist and therefore so horrific that it needed to be forced out. the same way that Ricky Rossello, I'm probably mispronounced his name, was forced out in Puerto Rico through mass pressure in the streets and in the public square. That was a pretty tall order, and we obviously failed to achieve that. When 2020 came up, a lot of people who refused fascism, very left, communists, socialists, so forth, broke form and said it's very important this time to vote because this regime is so horrible. It's a fascist regime, and if it's given a second term, you're going to see horror on a scale that you've never ever seen before. These are, you know, this is a party that includes people who wear T-shirts that say Pinochet did nothing wrong. There is no organizing for socialism. There is no organizing for a decent, sustainable society under fascism. Okay, there's no breathing room whatsoever. So it was very important to vote. And my calculations are very different this time too, because I knew, like Timothy Snyder knew in 2017, that Trump was not going to accept defeat and was going to try and make a legal, political, and very possibly relatedly physical case for staying in power, even if he was defeated. So I looked at the Des Moines Register poll in 2020, and again, Trump was going to win. But this time I decided it was important to vote for Biden. Why? Because in fighting against the coming coup attempt and in being in place to actually resist the coming coup attempt, and we had a hard time getting liberals and progressives to realize there was a coming coup attempt. I was in Zoom sessions where people just wouldn't accept it. I go, are you paying attention to this guy? He's not going to accept removal. But anyway, this time the total popular vote would matter. It would be of political significance. You would want Biden's margin that Trump was trying to, as Trump was trying to overthrow the election, to be as big as possible. So for the second time in my life, I voted for a Democratic presidential candidate. In terms of what the left needs to do, I don't think it doesn't need to be shamefaced about lesser evil voting. The shaming by people on the left of lesser evil voting is just ridiculous. It just has to stop. It's ballot fetishes. It's reducing someone's total politics to what they do for 5 minutes in a ballot box. You know, give me a freaking break. So, yeah, I would think any kind of idiot wants FDR instead of Hoover. They want McGovern instead of Nixon. They want even horrible, dismal sleeping car Joe strikebreaker Biden in there instead of a second Donald Trump term. I get that, but then let's get over that, you know. And what are you doing after this one slice of politics that we are told is the most important thing a citizen can ever do, which is mark a ballot box. So you need social movements beneath and beyond the electoral extravaganzas that are sold to us as the only politics that matters. And the abortion issue is a perfect case study in that right now. Oh, we'll rely on the courts and we'll show them at the ballot. This whole thing, we'll show them at the ballot box. Well, I don't know that you will. Not without the real kind of social movement pressure that's required.
Even the phrase, and I was going to say I didn't want to interrupt. Sure. Apparently I did have an instinct to interrupt. I just didn't have such an instinct that it was successful. Even the phrase lesser of two evils, doesn't that help build a sort of rhetorical substructure that reinforces this idea that making a strategic choice betwixt the candidates who can win is somehow a sin, and it just is a lesser of a sin? I mean, what I am remarking about, what I'm looking for, maybe just casting about with insufficient preparation, but what I'm looking for is to find leftist strategists and leftist thinkers and writers who are thinking about how to build the rhetorical substructure, build the rhetorical architecture, build the set of tenets by which a movement can be successful. And if too often I will have conversations with dear friends whose politics would be big fans of yours, for instance, and it seems that they are most triggered by their anger. And I appreciate from you, your greatest anger, my word anger, not yours. Your greatest anger is, your greatest priority is trained at would-be fascists. So often I see leftists whose greatest anger is trained at Hillary Clinton, or whose greatest anger is who feel betrayed by the Democratic Party, and when they then go by, well, what went wrong in a given election, they start with, Hillary Clinton was blank, or was not blank, or did not do blank, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is they talk about, maybe there's something about Trump. And then the third thing is, this is what we could have done as a pro-democracy or pro-social or pro-people or pro sort of more collective approach of an economy, organizing base, what we could have done, that it casts about in a way that may or may not be accurate and may or may not be helpful. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, I would say my main target, ultimately, at the end of the day, is capitalism, or what I would call capitalism imperialism. However, I don't think there's any serious organizing of any kind against capitalism or imperialism under fascism. And in fact, I think definitionally what fascism is all about is destroying any oppositional culture whatsoever. If you ask me, the biggest issue of our or any time is climate change. Climate change in the lead of environmental catastrophe, and I would in turn be ready to, extrapolate on how climate change is a direct consequence of growth and fossil fuel addicted capitalism. So fine, but there's no chance. There's no breathing space. There's no way you organize against climate change and for sustainable ecology under fascism. When Trump came in, everybody up at Standing Rock knew very well that they were going from, that they were going to head to live ammunition. This was now an absolutely repressive fossil fascist regime that was going to shoot people down. So just understand that my hostility towards fascism is intimately related back to my hostility to capitalism, which, by the way, is the seedbed of fascism, because it simultaneously undermines, through concentrated wealth and power, faith in democracy and the functionality of democratic institutions, just with concentrated money power, at the same time that it recurrently creates crises in daily life and society that require big government intervention. So it just inherently creates this context for I alone can fix it authoritarians to come in and pretend to end the carnage and the chaos. But yes, fascism is a strategic enemy in the immediate sense. And the other target is, I understand lesser evil voting, and I don't demonize anyone for doing lesser evil voting.
But by calling it lesser evil voting, right? You've just said that somebody's doing evil, and somebody who is approaching their politics by wanting to do good, in fact, who is thinking about their own morality as the primary filter through which they engage in the enterprise, calling it lesser evil voting, doesn't that itself, if you're saying, it's lesser evil voting, but I still think people should do it, I mean, doesn't that end up
I see what you're saying. Tangled? Okay, yeah. Well, then you have to be very careful about that conversation. You have to make it clear exactly what you're talking about when you. I'm going to find it very difficult to step back from describing the Obama regime, which ended, doing everything it could to try and pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and which was incredibly authoritarian neoliberal measure, which did everything it could to crush, Ralph Nader's single-payer national health insurance, which never actually worked. I'm just talking as a progressive here, kind of in the Bernie Sanders mode. I'm left of that, but which completely dropped its campaign pledges to push forward with the re-legalization of union organizing through card check, authorization. I could go on about the abandonment of the progressive agenda by Obama. So I'm going to have a tough time not being highly, highly critical of that, but and of being honest about what my ultimate agenda is, which is a socialist revolutionary replacement of capitalism by socialism. I know, tall order, right? Good luck with that. But nonetheless, I tend to think that's an existential necessity, and I think that particularly on an ecological level, an environmental level. I just don't see humanity surviving decades more of capitalism. And then have that conversation that for me, the vote, the tactical vote, is largely about breathing space and being able to stay alive and make my case for the particular agenda that me and my fellow green socialist, Marxist, communists are trying to make. I think a lot of my anger, though, is directed not at the choices people make in voting at all. Well, of course, if they make Republic fascist choices, I'm pretty angry at that, but not at the choices that people make. I don't know a lot of those people. I don't have many friends or relatives that do that, but at those for whom the full total definition of political engagement is 2 minutes in a ballot box once every 2 or 4 years. I'm telling you, we needed to have millions people in the streets who support girls and women and transgender people last summer before the Dobbs v. Jackson decision went down. It's not about voting. And it's the same on the mifepristone issue right now, which is absolutely horrific. It's going back to the Supreme Court, and they may very well ultimately rule to take away the leading medical abortion pill nationwide. We're not talking about red states, blue states anymore. We need, in addition to the least awful human beings in office, we need millions of people in the streets to make it clear in a Mario Savio kind of way, in the way that PBS showed recently in a documentary. The anti-war mobilization movement in 1969 made it clear to Nixon and Kissinger, if you use nuclear weapons, and they wanted to, we know this from the internal documents on Vietnam, all hell's going to break loose. There's also the politics of social movement. All this talk about a blue wave in the midterms, which did not pan out. Yes, fine. We're gonna. It's very cynical. Oh, the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which ended the woman's constitutional right to an abortion, is terrible. But it's okay because we'll show them at the ballot box, and then the Democrats subsequently lost the House of Representatives as they were, but maybe by less than they would have. You say we need a green wave, not a blue wave like in Latin America. The women who came out in millions to save abortion rights in Argentina and Mexico.
So you use the tone of voice. I heard that your tone of voice, we'll show them at the ballot box. Where are you wanting to show them? If you were able to get, where does that sound of contempt come from?
Which one?
One sounds of contempt. We'll show them in the ballot box. And you say that with derision. And I'm saying, where do you want them? You say, well, you're not going to show them the ballot box. Where do you want to show them?
In the streets and in the public squares. I really believe that if millions had come out, how about just hundreds of thousands, in a really forceful kind of way, after for example, last year, after the Dobbs v. Jackson decision was leaked in May, there was some remarkable action. I participated in Chicago. There was some extraordinary die-ins and gatherings, and if that had been, if our call, and when I say our call, Rise Up for Abortion Rights call for thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people in the streets to make it clear that the very legitimacy of the Supreme Court as an institution would be fundamentally called into question if they went forward with this decision. I think it's distinctly possible, maybe not, that they might have decided, out of concerns primarily for the legitimacy of their own institution and the survival of their own institution as it was a legitimate force, not to make that decision. And that decision has been a disaster. Women, because of the Christian fascist majority on the Supreme Court, which is a profoundly authoritarian institution, are going septic, being forced to carry dead babies, giving birth to children they don't have the money for. And, there are 18 states now in the country that have essentially outlawed or effectively banned women's reproductive freedom. And,
right. And so to the question and to your point, when you say we'll show the ballot box, and you say it with some sarcasm in your voice, you're saying you got to show them more than that. You got to go deeper and broader.
That's what. You're right. And the answer all the time from the establishment liberal Democratic Party captive choice organizations, NARAL and Planned Parenthood and some of the repro groups has been, we don't need to do that. Oh, listen, they can't take abortion away. We still have the pill. That was said last year. I can't tell you how many people said why they don't have to come out on the streets is we still have the pill. And we would say, are you kidding me? They're going to go after mifepristone, and then they'll go after misoprostol. Oh, we'll show them at the ballot box. Biden's going to sign a bill that codifies Roe v. Wade as national law. And I'd say, are you kidding me? Do you understand how the Senate is apportioned and how the Senate is set up? Even if you keep the House, which you probably won't, that's not going to happen. You know, it's going to take something more. I'm not against voting at all. I vote.
I'll say something. And it is absolutely true that one of the challenges of the I have a socialist friend, which sounds like I'm trying to avoid sounding like a racist, but I have a socialist friend who has a line. He says, I don't know if the revolution will be televised, but I don't believe the revolution will be funded. And it's absolutely true that if what you're trying to do is meet your advocacy nonprofit budget, that means raising money. And when you're raising money, whether it's for an environmental group or a pro-choice group, you're raising money for people who and I've had to raise money, and I view it as an honorable pursuit to gather the resources to do something that is honorable and that is important. And it does mean you're spending more of your time with people who are economically comfortable. Now, if you're working in a Planned Parenthood clinic, you are seeing a cross section of humanity. If you are attending, name your nonprofit fundraiser, right? Most of your nonprofit fundraisers are not in in centers of poverty in the United States of America, right? And so then you build that email list, your most valuable relationships of the organization, your donor list, and that donor list is not a list that spends most of its time thinking they should go into the streets. And I will say, with a very prominent exception of the Women's March, right, that which was an enormous participation and people of all walks of economic life. But I will agree with that. But I want to get into this a little bit. The intersection of democracy and a desire to see a particular economic system pass. That and you described say again. You say ultimately what I think we need, and you said it quickly and adroitly. Say again at ultimately the system you think that needs to win in the United States. I'm sorry, I missed the last part. Needs to what? That needs to win in the United States. You're saying I'm not a capitalist, I'm a blank. Ultimately, I'm not I'm not merely progressive. I think we need to do blank. And you used 3 or 4 words for it, and I want to make sure I quote it accurately. Socialist, revolutionary socialist, yeah, and to that, it seems odd to me that I have to add that qualification, revolutionary, to it. What it means is that, to me, what it means is that you embrace the taking of state power and the using of state power. There's a squeamishness about that. Because if you actually get in there and say, we are going to redirect from the vantage point of power in the political superstructure, and we are going to try and seriously move to redirect the structuring of society down to its material base around the common good, and this has to be sustainable in the 21st century and has to be around livable ecology, and away from the endless pursuit of profit and the competitive mode of so many Marxists are obsessed with class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat up here, whereas the main dynamic in capitalism seems to me is always, especially in the absence of a radical left, and there is the absence of it by and large, is actually the competitions between capitals, where they're constantly pushing each other to grow further and further out and to expand further and further and find new resources to exploit and new people to exploit and so on and so forth. The hell with livable ecology. We're really going to push down into that kind of revolutionary structural institutional change. Dr. King used to talk about the radical reconstruction of society itself
is the real issue to be faced. The most famous last words, Dr. King, 1968. Then that's going to meet a strong counter-reaction, physical counter-reaction, disinvestment, ideological assault, accusations of Stalinism and totalitarianism, and on and on and on. So it's a really big deal. It means you don't go, okay, we should seize power. You will then have to continue on in an agitation for against the counter reaction, against the counter revolution. It's a hell of a thing to embrace, and it's really serious. We're nowhere near the kind of organization and the forces anywhere in the populace on the left, outside small little groups that are anywhere near ready for that right now. But we're going to have to, in some way, shape, or form, get there. And I'm personally, by the way, I'm someone who I was the vice president for research and planning at a very conservative bourgeois civil rights organization, the Chicago Urban League, for 5 years. I have been there. I love to write grants. I was great at writing grants. It was fun. The money chase was fun to me. Get these foundations, the MacArthur Foundations, the Woods Foundation, I'm forgetting some of the names of Joyce Foundation, to fund programs. I did a project study that became a big deal in Chicago. Obama came and picked up and ran with it when he was a state senator, about ex-offenders, about criminal record, about felony record, about the race and color. And it inspired Michelle Alexander to write her book, The New Jim Crow, about what felony record is. And I've been there, and you're absolutely right. You're talking to an entirely different group of people, and they're not about writing checks to put people into the streets, to Mario Savio to put their bodies on the gears of the machine and grind it to a halt. That's not what the MacArthur Foundation wants. Obama took my study, which was a many-sided study about how awful felony record is for Black people, and went down to Springfield with it. I knew about a lot of us on the left in Chicago knew about Obama before he became president. That's why we were so jaundiced about him, expected so little from him, so critical. Took it, went down to Springfield, and crafted the most milquetoast, irrelevant little bill that provided some sort of certificate of maybe you're okay to hire this person if they had one nonviolent marijuana conviction, leaving out just pretty much the whole ex-offender population. Put that on his resume, called it progressive, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of exact opposite of revolutionary changes. At the same time, he was going to the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and saying that most Americans supported the invasion of Iraq, and that it was mainly the main victims of it were U.S. troops, and stuff like that. So I don't know why I just went off on that tangent.
Let me try to get back. Let me try back. You said the words I was hoping. I just didn't want to misquote you, right? So you say you want a revolutionary socialist governance structure. What role does democracy play in that?
It's a very problematic matter to seize power in a revolutionary fashion in the name of democracy, and then it would not mean everything you do being held up to a popular plebiscite, particularly in a kind of society where private money will always be trying to sway people in the other direction. I don't think there's ever been a successful revolution that hasn't involved a certain aspect of vanguardism, and there is a certain aspect of authoritarianism about any revolution that comes in, because it's always going to be facing a significant measure of counter-revolution, and that counter-revolution is undoubtedly at times going to have to be suppressed. And I think revolutions are not for the faint of heart by any stretch of the imagination, but the impulse behind a socialist revolution historically, and there have been examples in the 20th century, and I don't think that their failures were inherent in an internal authoritarian nature of them. I think their key failures had to do with encirclement and international hostility, and yes, counter-revolution, and those two interacting with one another. The impulse behind them is, with an appropriate measure of vision and concern and care for the common good, is to create a world in which there's a measure of equality and a measure of security, and a measure, yes, of democracy, that the majority of the population would, if given the opportunity, to vote that revolutionary government out of power. And I do think that option should always be there. I mean, we're way off in the future now. I mean, I don't expect to see this in my lifetime, but I do think that any socialist revolutionary government that were to come into being, perhaps in the wake of a kind of meltdown that frankly seems possible because of environmental tendencies, among other trends, would have to contain at all times the possibility of being voted out of power. So I don't believe in maximal dictators for life or any of that kind of stuff. You'd have to prove it. You'd have to prove that your measure, some of which will come across as authoritarian. I don't think that ever goes away. I don't think the state power goes away. Maybe this is classic Marxism. The state doesn't go away, and the state does involve coercion. It always has. It always will. In classic Marxist theory, and I think it's right, the state doesn't go away until class goes away, until oppression goes away, until institutions of exploitation and oppression, all the way down to the material base, until they're defeated. You're going to have a state. But not all states are the same. Not all state coercion is the same. There will be state. I always say, people, defund the police. What are you talking about? You're not going to defund the police under capitalism. Furthermore, you will have police under socialism. But there'll be different types of police. They won't be just shooting people down in the street because they're poor, because they're black, or because they're Hispanic, because they come from another country. It's a different type of state power. And not all forms of state power are the same. I think the left should embrace and want to use and wield state power. Sometimes that will be an authoritarian fashion. I don't think there's any way around that. And ultimately, if they can't create a kind of sustainable and egalitarian and decent and open and intellectually libertine and exciting. I mean, I was in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. I mean, one of the problems with classic Eastern Bloc socialism, it weren't really even the kinds of societies anyone wanted to live in. I would advocate a socialism with a wide open intellectual, cultural environment, open to all kinds of ideas, where everything is argued out. Everything is argued out, and where science and art and literature are not just constantly subjected to ideological supervision, right? We have to be able to form arguments in all kinds of different directions. And it's a balancing act, and I think it'll be very difficult.
Are there examples of revolutionary socialist or socialist revolutions that you hold up as exemplars?
I think that the initial Soviet revolution, 1917, is often portrayed in Western scholarship as just something like a coup. Like there was just a few dastardly Bolsheviks that kind of, waved a magic wand and stepped into the same exact position as the Tsar. I think that's problematic and deceptive. There was a real upheaval. There was a real upheaval of peasants and of workers and soldiers that was popular, and there was egalitarian. There was a real drive for workers' control. I'm afraid that in many ways that was premature, and that was doomed by encirclement and by underdevelopment and all kinds of things like that. But I noticed that there was a modernization even under the Soviet model. There was a Soviet accomplishment. And there was a defeat, and there was a reason that the Third Reich was tolerated and appeased to no small extent by the West to destroy the existence of a government that, in halting in all kinds of problematic kinds of ways, was in fact trying to develop, and was to some extent developing, often in brutal ways, outside capitalism. The Third Reich wasn't tolerated and sort of directed against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was considered to be authoritarian and totalitarian. It was directed against them because it was operating and functioning outside capitalism, and that's why it was hated. And there was a social welfare state created. There was urbanization. There was modernization. There's all kinds of things happened even under the flawed bureaucratic collectivist model. So that's an example. I think the revolution under Mao was more exciting and more interesting and more many-sided, and again, defeated, as was not surprising.
So then so your exemplars are the Soviet and Communist China revolutions.
I don't know that I would say that. I wouldn't say exemplars. I think
That was my question. That was my question.
halting and beginning 20th century efforts to develop outside and against capitalism, that were flawed both internally and externally in ways that are completely unsurprising, but nonetheless should not just be automatically and reflexively demonized and just considered to have been inherently totalitarian, inherently evil, that can be built upon, including their own mistakes. And and I would say there were all kinds of mistakes, obviously, that took place in the Soviet Union and in China.
It is this discussion is, and I don't mean just our hour together, but this series of discussions is about democracy and and how we view an economic system, and my own belief as I expose it is that democracy has within it. I'm not a democracy fundamentalist, but I am a democracy loyalist. That the consent of the governed is at its basis, arguably the most important moral basis for a government structure. And I hear your critique is like, yeah, but if that can be manipulated, right? If one can manipulate the consent of the governed, then it is an insufficient. It is an insufficient measure of virtue, and I hear that. I both anticipate and understand that critique. And you set aside the word exemplar, but if even just the examples of socialist revolutions are in fact the communist China and Soviet revolutions, and if we also grade their results after that as part of what happened, it does make me sort of stick to that question, right? Where is democracy's place in a socialist revolution? And you answer that to some degree, which is, well, there'd be some authoritarianism. And it also then gets me, where do you then draw the line between if examples of socialist revolutions include armed takeovers of the means of government, right? Irrespective of a vote. Clarify, and this will bring us back to maybe the beginning of the discussion, but clarify the difference between that and an authoritarian fascist control of government, right? And it's like if there were January 6th, but what was happening is that it was a proletariat revolution, that it was a workers of the world toppling the capital to install somebody who would sort of democratize, I maybe should avoid that word, that would egalitarianize the means of production. How should we think about that?
I was very sort of taken aback by a piece on Substack and the sheer post that my friend Chris Hedges did some weeks back, maybe some months back, in which it was like a defense of the January 6th rioters, the fascist putschists who assaulted the U.S. Capitol in a literal white nationalist attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, to stop the certification of Joe Biden's not completely, but his legitimate, under our existing rules, election, the presidency of the United States. And the argument, among other things, was that the January 6th protesters, he actually said, were being lynched. They're being overly repressed. And I was blown away by the use of the phrase lynching. I was like, gee whiz, Google up the phrase white supremacism. Google up white privilege, please. If those protesters had been black, or or Latino or indigenous or all of those, they would have been lined up against the wall, shot. So give me a break with sympathy for the January 6th protesters. But the linchpin of the argument, you hear this on the Trump and left, is that if you support the repression, incarceration, the punishment of the January 6 protesters. And by the way, the biggest January 6 protesters aren't behind bars, are like led by Donald Trump. I mean, you want to find injustice in the persecution of the January 6 rioters. Then, the real question is, okay, you got these operatives on the ground doing time in Washington, D.C. jails, and the top fascist of all of them is still running around free. But the argument these Trump and left sorts will make is that then you're making it more difficult for the left, because the left also supports insurrection, and the left also supports the physical overthrow of the government. To that, I always say, do you really think that a socialist uprising, a socialist upheaval, would involve a bunch of maniacal, jacked up, juiced up thugs physically going after the democratically elected, so-called, we got a lot of problems with our democracy, but going after the U.S. Capitol and breaking in windows and trashing this Time War institution and wiping their defecation on the walls and saying, hey, Nancy, where's Nancy? And talking about hanging people by their necks and all that. That's your idea of a revolution? No, a socialist uprising, nothing to do with that. And the socialist revolutions of the past have not been like that. They would involve mass movements across the country. A socialist, quote unquote, uprising, socialist revolutionary movement would involve strikes, general strikes, political strikes. The trade unions go on strike for economic stuff. In revolutionary situations, unions go on strike. They have political strike. There would be furious women in the streets talking about demanding abortion rights, and other aspects of that. There would be people of color joining with white people up against racist police violence. There would be, coordinated and uncoordinated outpourings of human beings saying no more business. And I always like to say no more business rule as usual. And that we will take control of government broadly, local, state, and federal levels, and turn it to the interest of humanity, all humanity, against and over and against the profits system and all of that. This wouldn't be about a bunch of thugs breaking in. That's a wholly different thing. That's what the January 6th thing was an attempt to do, was bring about a coup and install a particular type of capitalist politician who had crossed over into fascism as a de facto strongman, dear leader for life. That has nothing to do with what a socialist uprising would be. They're very, very different things. So, and if you don't think, and if Hedges or anyone else thinks that leftists can't distinguish themselves and their idea of what mass movements are from the January 6th protesters, that's pretty lame. They're very different types of people, to say the least. And so, I mean, of course they should be locked up. My God, Jamie Raskin was right when he referred to the January 6th protesters as fascist traitors. My God. Of course, the big one needs to be locked up. And we'll see if that ever happens. His name is Donald Trump.
Picking back then up on Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say, you can tell me whether it's fair to say or not, that like the political establishment, you may have been somewhat unserious about the menace that Trump presented to American democracy at the time, right? Like you looked at the polls, and when you voted for for Jill Stein, you did that as an Iowa voter, not having a concern that would actually impact the vote counts, except for maybe in the collective subconscious. Is it fair to say that you underestimated the threat? And is this book, I think, as many people, I think it's true for a lot of people, sort of an effort to kind of redouble efforts and awareness about that, including among people who may not have taken it as seriously. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, it's weird because, like I said, I had this, I was of split mind and somewhat, a little bit in a confused state, I think, in 2015 and 2016. Because on one hand, I do have this piece. Like I said, people can look it up, Google my name in May 2016, and the Donald can happen here. I'm clearly saying that Trump can happen. I'm blaming it largely on the Democrats. I'm saying they leave the barn door open, they delegitimize democracy, and they'll let him walk in. They'll let him walk into power, which kind of happened. And then on the other hand, I had a piece at some point, I mentioned it, and this happened here. I can't find it anymore online. I think it's still there. Back when I wrote for Truthdig, I was prevailed upon. It's one of the stupidest mistakes I ever made in my life. I was prevailed upon by Kevin Zeese, the late Kevin Zeese of the Green Party, who I've really broken with the Green Party since Trump, because the Green Party's been full of Trump and leftists and just goofballs. And I just don't think it has anything to do with anything anyway. But in any event, Zeese prevailed upon me to write a piece that somewhat dismissed the danger of Trump. It's absolutely true. I copped to that in the maybe I cite the article somewhere in somewhere in the book, and argued pretty much that capitalists already have everything they need. This is the second piece, from fascism without actually full-on fascism. Sort of argued that, which is something you hear on the Trump and left a lot. So I myself have had some history of occasionally making that argument. So I was mixed. I did not expect Trump to win. I was somewhat shocked when I said what I did in Iowa, that I voted for Jill Stein. That's because I relied on the Des Moines Register poll. It's a good poll, and they were right. I knew Iowa was going to Trump. Iowa had gone red by 2016. There just was no doubt about it, right? And I didn't think Trump was going to win nationally. I didn't think he was going to get Wisconsin, and I didn't think he was going to get Michigan. I did not know that Hillary was going to drop the ball and he was going to pick up the ball in the blue wall upper Rust Belt states. I had no idea. So I thought I was okay. So I didn't have that calculation that the overall popular vote mattered. Like I said, that calculation changed by 2020, because I knew he's going to try and have a coup. I'm repeating myself. I knew he's going to try and have a coup, and that in arguing against the coup, and I was hoping people going into the streets against the 2020 coup, the total popular vote would matter for Biden. We'd be able to cite that and go, see, he won by 10 million, or he won by 11 million, or he won by 12 million, which would just help discredit the coup even further. So yeah, things changed. Yeah, I changed my attitude. The Trump 4 years was very instructive to me, but I was on it as fascism to some degree before, and then pretty much through all of it, just because of what he did, the horror of it. I think a lot of people had no idea that this menace was as close to the political superstructure surface as it was, and this is not unlike the scenario in It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, right, in the 1930s, where Buzz Windrip gets in and people can't quite believe it because that can't happen here. And he's a comic character. The main character, the fascist president in that novel, that 1930 novel, It Can't Happen Here, is like a clown. He's like a joke. He's like a buffoon, seriously? Which, by the way, was some of the response to Adolf Hitler, even after he seized power in Germany, the 1930s. That guy? Really? Seriously? Seriously. As they say in the Black community, serious as a heart attack. Donald Trump was serious as a heart attack. And he had one thing I do in my book, notice I go, I don't call it, I don't call it that, fully consolidated. I never say fully consolidated fascism happened. I leave it somewhat ambiguous. The title is This Happened. Okay? They did not get all of Congress. They did not get all the states. They did not get everything, but they did get the White House. And so I call it This Happened Here. And I document, I think it's my third chapter, just this whack-a-mole of insanity for 4 years. You can know something's coming. And I feel that way about January 6th too. You can sense that something's coming, but you're still in shock, and it's still educational. And the trauma is beyond what you, even at a physical level. I saw people physically traumatized by the election of Trump, physically traumatized, and by January 6th too. And to actually experience it is another thing. I actually experienced it, and the ambiguity, the tension within my analysis disappeared. I realized that I was completely full of crap to have listened to Kevin Zeese, and for him to prevail upon me to write a minimalizing piece. And I think if it's still out there, I should ask Truthdig to take it down, because it's embarrassing that I did it. On the other hand, I had that May 2016 piece. I'm not sure I answered your question.
I don't know if you did either, but excuse
But
me.
hopefully it was entertaining anyway.
That's all right. That's all right. I want to say, I think we've gone way over the time we'd requested, and thank you so much for being so generous with yours.
Oh, sure.
Your argument is that Trump's brand of white nationalist fascism is alive and breathing in America today. As a closing thought, what do you think needs to be done about it? If you had a last notion to share with folks, maybe it's as simple as take to the streets when taking to the streets is warranted. But what say you?
Well, listen, there's a wonderful essay that I wish everybody would read that I think it goes really to the point of how I feel about this. And it was called The Election Madness. And it's by Howard Zinn, and it came out in the Progressive in March of 2008. And he repeated the time-worn, and I'm a historian, by the way, so was Howard, the time-worn Zinn line that it's not just about who's sitting in the White House and who's sitting in the suites, it's also about who's sitting in the streets. And Zinn is very clear and very consistent with the way I've been talking during this interview, saying, let me be clear, he said, I'm not talking about an infantile leftist argument that you should never vote. Would I prefer to have FDR in the White House instead of Herbert Hoover in 1932? Of course I would. Would I prefer to have George McGovern instead of Richard Nixon win the White House in 1972? Of course I would. Anybody better than George W. Bush? Of course. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden instead of Donald Trump? Yes, that's right. And by the way, we might be looking at Trump again in 2024. But he says, after those 2 minutes, what are you going to do? I want to know what you're doing besides, beneath and beyond those, what Noam Chomsky calls those quadrennial extravaganzas that are sold to us as that's politics, the only politics that matters. The forces that have brought about change, that have introduced significant fundamental expansions of human, social, civil, and environmental rights in this country have always come from the bottom up, and they've developed beneath, during, and after electoral politics. The civil rights movement, the women's movement that created Roe v. Wade and that made abortion, women's right to an abortion in the first place, wasn't just achieved by voting. The Black Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks, the Flint sit-down strike in 1937, absolutely critical to the establishment of collective bargaining and the consolidation of the National Labor Relations Act as a viable tool. Collective, on and on. You can go through all of this, and you need that too. There needs to be a force in the streets, like there was in '69, that told Nixon and Kissinger, you know what, you bomb Vietnam with nuclear weapons, which they wanted to do, and all hell's going to break loose in this country. We need that kind of pressure. The fascists are not afraid to go to the streets in their own particular awful, horrific, revanchist, racist, brutal kind of way. We should not be afraid to go to the streets and in the public squares and to struggle in the broad political culture and to talk about what's really in front of us. This is really critical, to actually talk about what we're facing. And I don't care if someone's a social, I'm a Popular Front, United Front person. I want anti-fascism unity across sectarian lines and across lines between liberals, progressives, Marxists, anarchists, communists, and all that. Everybody who believes in humanity needs to unite against the main strategic enemy facing us right now, which is in fact fascism. And to do that, they have to be able to identify it for what it really is, and to pull together the strands that define that menace and to actually confront it. And I think that's really critical. Now, if you ask me beyond that, ultimately, we don't just want to have the power to say to the White House, to the Supreme Court, to Congress, oh, you better listen to us, or all hell will break loose. Ultimately, we need to become the power. We need to take state power. That's revolution. That's not on the agenda right now. I would like it to be, but I'm not going to be free to make the case for it under Christian white nationalism, neo-fascism, or just plain fascism.
Paul Street, author of This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. Thank you so much for joining us today, Paul. Appreciate you.
That's super. Thank you.